Some women don't shout anymore. They don't argue, they don't explain, they don't beg to be seen. They simply become quiet, and that quiet becomes dangerous. Not because it's filled with rage, but because it's filled with awareness. There is a certain calm that terrifies those who once fed on her doubt. It's the calm that comes after the storm, when she realizes she was never the storm at all. She was the sky. He feels it before she says a word. Something in her has shifted, subtly, irreversibly. She no longer waits for his attention to anchor her. She no longer performs softness in exchange for scraps of affection. Her eyes, once pleading for understanding, now look straight through illusion. And it shakes him, because her silence doesn't sound like absence. It sounds like power. Jung once wrote that when a woman integrates her shadow, she becomes whole. This wholeness is not loud. It's not glamorous. It's still, deep, terrifying in its simplicity. Because when she no longer needs validation, the entire structure of control begins to collapse. Every man who sought to define her, every projection she once carried, every mirror that told her she wasn't enough, it all fades into irrelevance. And yet, this isn't rebellion. This isn't revenge. It's revelation. The kind of revelation that comes from standing in front of a mirror long enough to see through it. The calm woman is not cold. She is precise. Her love is no longer scattered. It is sovereign. Her attention is no longer currency. It is sacred offering. In her, the archetype of the self begins to awaken. The anima, once trapped in the longing to be chosen, has now turned inward, choosing herself. Her stillness is not emptiness. It is containment. It is what happens when a soul stops leaking energy into others' approval and starts nourishing its own roots. The world calls her distant. Men call her mysterious. But what she truly is free. And freedom, in its purest form, is dangerous. Because a woman who no longer needs validation cannot be manipulated, cannot be guilt, cannot be controlled through love or silence. Her peace becomes a boundary, her presence becomes a mirror, and her withdrawal becomes an earthquake in the hearts of those who once mistook her need for weakness. He tries to provoke her, with distance, with silence, with indifference. But nothing lands, because she no longer reacts. Her validation no longer lives in his eyes. It lives in her awareness. This is the beginning of individuation, the quiet rebellion of a soul reclaiming its center. She no longer chases meaning through others. She creates it through being. And that is the most dangerous calm of all. Something shifts in the field between them, subtle, invisible, undeniable. At first, he doesn't understand it. He only feels a strange unease, as though the air around her has thickened with meaning. Her absence has texture now. Her silence has gravity. The same woman whose voice once trembled in explanation now sits still, her presence calm, yet impenetrable. He can't find her in the ways he used to. Not through charm. Not through guilt. Not even through silence. Because her silence now speaks a language his ego cannot translate. It's a mirror. And mirrors, to the unready mind, are unbearable. Jung said that a man projects his inner feminine, the anima, onto the woman he desires. He doesn't see her, he sees the reflection of what he has not yet met within himself. And when she withdraws, when her energy pulls back into its own orbit, the illusion begins to fracture. The projection collapses. He doesn't miss her immediately. He misses the feeling of himself that her presence gave him. The validation, the reflection, the soft light that made him feel whole without ever doing the work to be whole. Now that light is gone, and he feels the void, the same void she once drowned in. This is where the dangerous calm begins to haunt him. Because what he mistakes for coldness is not rejection, it's detachment. And detachment is something the wounded ego cannot comprehend. She used to meet his distance with pursuit. She used to fill the silence with explanations. But now, she simply watches. She no longer fights to be understood. She no longer rushes to prove her worth. She lets his disconnection hang in the air, unrescued, unsoftened, unmasked. And that stillness forces him to face himself. This is the part men often describe as her changing. But it's not change, it's revelation. He's finally seeing who she was beneath the projections. For so long, he believed her warmth existed for his comfort, that her empathy was evidence of devotion, that her forgiveness was an infinite well. But now he sees it for what it truly was. Her essence, her divine energy, the sacred feminine in its purest, unreciprocated form. And when that energy retracts, his reality begins to unravel. He wonders why her eyes no longer seek his approval, why her laughter no longer dances around his validation, why her silence doesn't ache with longing, but breathes with peace. He can feel it. Something in her has gone beyond him. It's not anger. It's not indifference. It's transcendence. Her energy used to orbit around his moods, his attention, his desire. But now it moves independently, like a planet discovering its own gravity. He senses the difference in every conversation. She no longer reacts, she responds. She no longer explains, she observes. She no longer asks, "Do you still love me?" Because she no longer needs the answer. Her love has become an internal flame. It doesn't flicker for validation, it burns for truth. And truth is the one thing the ego cannot manipulate. This is when he starts reaching back. Not out of love, but out of loss. Not because he's ready to meet her soul, but because he can no longer bear his own silence. Her absence begins to echo through his days. In the quiet between his thoughts, in the stillness after his distractions fade. He replays her laughter, the way she once listened, the way she once looked at him, not realizing that what he misses most is the part of himself her love once reflected. That's the secret of projection. When she withdraws, he doesn't just lose her, he loses himself. And that realization, that terrifying mirror, is where his awakening begins. There comes a time in every woman's journey when her silence begins to echo louder than any plea for attention ever could. This is the calm after the storm, the quiet following years of emotional noise, of explaining herself to those committed to misunderstanding her. In that silence, something ancient awakens. It is not the passivity the world mistakes it for. It is the reclaiming of power from everything external, from every gaze that once defined her worth, every approval that once steadied her breathing. This calm is not emptiness, it is containment. The stillness of a sea that has learned it can drown or cradle, but chooses neither. He feels it too. The man who once fed on her emotional tides now finds himself disoriented in the still water. Her absence of reaction unsettles him. Her neutrality mirrors his chaos. For men who are not yet individuated, those still entangled in the projections of their anima, a woman's calm becomes unbearable. Because her silence reflects what he has buried. She becomes the mirror he cannot break, revealing his own lack of control, his unhealed boyhood, his fragmented identity. When she no longer performs the role of emotional supplier, when she no longer dances in the rhythm of his validation, his shadow begins to surface. He blames her withdrawal, her indifference, her serenity. But in truth, it is his own dependence that suffocates him. He feels punished, but she is not punishing. He feels rejected, but she is not rejecting. She simply exists outside his need to be needed. This is the moment of inversion, the shifting of energy that Jung called enantiodromia, the turning of opposites. What was once his dominance becomes fragility. What was once her submission becomes sovereignty. Her calm disturbs the collective script, that a woman must always soothe, explain, comfort. Instead, she watches. Quietly. Unreadable. He looks at her now and cannot locate the woman who once waited for his words, who once justified his distance. Her eyes no longer seek meaning in his silence, because she has found meaning in her own. In Jungian language, this is the woman who has integrated her animus, the masculine within. She no longer projects strength outward, for she has found it within. Her validation has returned home. She is both the nurturer and the protector now. This integration gives her that dangerous calm, not dangerous to her, but to those who once relied on her emotional labor to feel powerful. It's the same calm you see in the lioness after the hunt. in the mother who stops explaining herself to the child who refuses to listen, in the lover who no longer fears walking away from chaos. She understands something most never will, that silence is not the absence of love, it is the presence of discernment. And in that discernment, her energy refines. She no longer burns to be understood. She simply radiates in her knowing. He cannot follow her there, not yet, because to meet her in that stillness would require the death of his ego, the collapse of every illusion he built about control and power. And so he circles, restless, searching for reaction, for evidence that he still matters in her world. But her calm denies him that. Her presence, once emotional and warm, is now a mirror that reflects only truth. And truth, to the unhealed masculine, feels like rejection. Yet for her, it is liberation. Because she finally understands, she was never meant to be a mirror for someone else's unhealed shadow. She was meant to become the light that no longer bends. That dangerous calm is not her defense. It is her arrival. There comes a breaking point in every man who once fed on a woman's devotion, a point where her silence no longer feels like an act of withdrawal but like a mirror held to his face. He begins to sense what Jung called the collapse of projection, that moment when the illusions he cast upon her dissolve, and all that remains is himself, naked in his own shadow. When a woman stops seeking validation, she unintentionally becomes his teacher. Not through words, but through absence. Her calm becomes a paradox, the very thing he cannot understand and yet cannot forget. She is no longer a source of emotional nourishment, she becomes the void he cannot fill. And that void is sacred. It is the crucible of transformation. In her detachment, he begins to realize how much of his identity depended on her response. How many of his words were not expressions of love, but bids for control. How often his affection was a negotiation, his validation her currency. Now, without her emotional reflection, he stands face to face with the emptiness of his own ego. The silence she holds becomes unbearable because it exposes the noise within him. But for her, that same silence is peace. She walks through her days now like a woman who no longer needs to be understood to feel whole. She no longer over-explains, no longer apologizes for her boundaries, no longer chases connection through compliance. It is not pride that keeps her distant, it is wisdom. She has come to understand what most never will, that validation is a subtle form of dependency, a contract signed with one's self-worth in small, invisible ink. Every time she sought approval, she paid for it with pieces of her soul. But not anymore. Her validation now comes from a quieter place, a knowing that her worth does not fluctuate with another's attention. It is constant, eternal, self-sustained. She has reclaimed the energy once scattered across conversations, arguments, and endless proving. It has all returned home. In Jungian terms, this is individuation, the process of becoming whole. The merging of light and shadow, feminine and masculine, need and independence. It is the return to the self, not the mask she wore to be loved, not the wounds she carried to be seen, but the unshakable essence beneath it all. He feels the shift before he can name it. The same woman he once felt superior to now moves through the world untethered to his gaze. Her calm, once mistaken for fragility, now carries the weight of quiet authority. He tries to provoke her, to stir the waters again, but her silence does not waver. He cannot touch what he no longer owns. And in that moment, perhaps for the first time, he sees her clearly, not as an extension of his desire, not as the reflection of his ego, but as an entire universe standing before him, whole and sovereign. The power dynamic dissolves. The illusion of control disintegrates. Because power over another is an illusion born of insecurity, and she no longer participates in that illusion. Her validation was the currency that kept the game alive, and now that she no longer spends it, the game collapses. She is not angry. She is not bitter. She has simply outgrown the need to be small enough to be loved. This is the dangerous calm, not because it seeks destruction, but because it embodies truth. A woman who no longer needs validation is not a storm. She is the sky after the storm, vast, uncontainable, infinite. He will remember her not for her affection, but for the silence that taught him who he was. And she will move forward, not as a reaction, but as a realization. The calm was never the end of her story. It was the beginning of her becoming. There is a haunting kind of power that rises within a woman when she no longer seeks to be seen, because in that stillness, she begins to see herself. Her reflection no longer depends on someone else's eyes. Her beauty is no longer a mirror trick of admiration. Her worth no longer hangs from the trembling thread of approval. Instead, she moves through the world with the kind of grace that cannot be taught, the grace that comes from surviving herself, from walking through every fire that once promised to destroy her, and realizing she was the flame all along. This is not the coldness of indifference, but the warmth of awakening. She is no longer fueled by validation because she now draws from something deeper, self-recognition. Jung wrote that the greatest tragedy of the human psyche is our disconnection from the self, the divine core beneath the noise of ego and expectation. Most people never find it. They drown in projection, in roles, in chasing significance through others. But she has reached it. Not through comfort but through collapse. Not through love returned, but love withheld. Because silence, when endured with awareness, becomes a sacred teacher. It strips away every false identity until only truth remains. And this truth is quiet, like moonlight on water. It doesn't shout, it simply exists. He will feel it the next time he sees her, that calm steadiness that does not reach out, does not bend, does not explain. He will speak, perhaps, searching for a trace of the woman who once needed to be understood. But she will only smile, not out of arrogance, but from a place of peace. Because she knows now, understanding from others was never the goal. Self-understanding was. The woman who no longer needs validation is not performing confidence. She is confidence. It radiates through her posture, her words, her silence. She doesn't argue her worth, she embodies it. And men feel that. Not as softness, but as gravity. He might not be able to name what has changed, but he senses it. She no longer orbits him. Her energy no longer pleads. She is no longer waiting to be chosen. She has already chosen herself. This is the power of individuation, when a woman's feminine energy becomes whole again, no longer fragmented by the chase for reassurance. Her emotional body, once fractured by seeking, fuses into oneness. She integrates her shadow, the parts that feared being unloved, the patterns that clung to attention, the wounds that begged to be healed by someone else. And in that integration she rises. Her emotions no longer control her, they guide her. Her love no longer seeks to save. It flows freely without attachment. Her care no longer empties her, it nourishes her. She has become the embodiment of what Jung called the self realized through consciousness. She is not the archetype of the maiden waiting for love, nor the mother endlessly giving. She is the sovereign, the union of softness and strength, empathy and detachment, heart and boundary. He will remember her differently now. Not as the woman who adored him, but as the one who awoke him. Not as the one who filled his void, but as the one who showed him it was his to fill. And while he wrestles with his ghosts, the echoes of her silence, the weight of her absence, she walks forward through a new landscape of her own making. Her peace is not an act of defiance. It is the reward of integration. She no longer asks, "Do you see me?" She simply knows, "I am." And that knowing changes everything. Because when a woman remembers who she is, the world subtly rearranges itself around her. The same situations that once drained her now reveal their lessons and pass away. The same people who once tested her now fade into the background. And the love she once begged for begins to appear, not because she needed it, but because she no longer does. That is the paradox of the awakened feminine. What she releases begins to return, not to complete her, but to reflect her wholeness. Her calm is not dangerous because it wounds, it's dangerous because it frees. It disrupts the unspoken order of a world that profits from female insecurity. It dismantles the power structures that thrive on her self-doubt. A woman who no longer needs validation cannot be manipulated. She cannot be tamed by flattery, nor controlled by silence. She has walked through both, and found herself beyond them. And in that sacred stillness, she smiles again. Not the smile that asks to be loved, but the one that says, "I am the love I was looking for." She no longer fights the darkness, she understands it. She no longer resists the unknown, she becomes it. She no longer fears being alone, because she realizes she never truly was. And so, she moves, steady, radiant, untouchable. The world may not understand her calm, may mistake it for detachment, arrogance, or mystery. But that's only because it has not yet learned the language of self-worth spoken through silence. Yes. And as she disappears into her own horizon, one truth remains. The woman who no longer needs validation is not cold, she is clear. Not dangerous, but deeply free. And in her calm, the entire world trembles. Because she finally remembers, she was never waiting to be chosen. She was always the choice.